Welcome. Thank you for watching this presentation on YouTube. My name is Matt Coombs. I'm with Utah Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. I'm the Bear River Area Sovereign Lands Coordinator. I work out of North Logan with Bear Lake, Bear River, and the north end of the Great Salt Lake. We're here to talk about our comprehensive management plan and specifically our process to update that plan that was initially done in 2009. It's been 10 years, so we're going to go through a process now to incorporate new information, relook at what our management objectives were, and we expect to be in this process until 2021. You'll see in the presentation there are a number of ways that you can participate and comment throughout that process, and we welcome that, so thank you. I'll just kind of start with the basic overview of sovereign lands. I could talk for a lot longer than I should, or you would be interested in about, our state code and who we are and what we're supposed to be doing and that sort of thing, but I thought I'd keep it pretty basic. When I first started working with the division, I was in graduate school. I had no idea what sovereign lands were. So I thought I'd just start with a definition. But sovereign lands are those lying below the ordinary high water mark of navigable bodies of water at statehood. So lakes and rivers that were navigable at statehood transferred from the federal government to the state government. And so those are what we call state sovereign lands in Utah. In other states, you'll commonly hear them referred to as submerged lands. At Bear Lake, we consider that ordinary high water mark to be 5923.65. That's kind of what's been established, and that's where we look at those boundaries. If you have more questions about that, we can talk about it. And then Utah Code 65A14, so the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands has executive authority for the management of sovereign lands. So in our area, like I said, I work mostly with Bear Lake, Bear River. We also work with the Great Salt Lake down this way, Jordan River, Utah Lake, and then the Green and Colorado rivers. And then management plans, which is why we're all here. So for each of our sovereign land resources, we're mandated to have a management plan or get one in place, and it makes life easier for us and hopefully things a little more clear for you in the process. But kind of our direction is that management plans shall guide implementation of stated management objectives. We'll talk about some of those, and then provide direction for land use decisions and activities on sovereign lands. So it gives us something to go back to when we're looking at proposed use or permitting or different projects and that sort of thing. So sovereign lands are a little bit special, I guess, in a way. But we manage for the public trust, so subject to the public trust. And what that means is these lands, when they transfer from the federal government to the state government, there's certain things that we've identified in Utah that are what we call public trust values. And we're really looking to make sure that we protect and enhance or preserve those values for future use. So this kind of gets at it, I guess, to me. And it's all uses must be regulated, so protection of navigation, fish and wildlife habitat, aquatic beauty, public recreation, and water quality are given due consideration and balanced against benefit from any proposed use. So they are federal.
I know that, but
So they also have jurisdiction over some things. We'll talk a little bit about different pieces and how we have people participating, but kind of the crux of it is that we have these public trust values that we're mandated to protect, but we also have to facilitate use of that land as a public resource. And so it's kind of balancing these two things is really kind of our challenge. So in addition to managing for the public trust, which identifies a lot of those values, then we also manage under a multiple use framework. And so these are some of the things that we really will be looking at and considering as we move forward in this process. But the first one is highest and best use of the resources. So taking a look at what's there and what the best use is. both present and future uses, which we'll look at a little bit in a second, how we translate that. But so existing uses are considered as well as potential uses moving forward, and then the suitability of any proposed area or any proposed use in a certain area, the impact of those uses on the sovereign land resource, compatibility of uses. So as we know at Bear Lake, we have multiple perspectives from adjacent landowners to non-adjacent landowners to day use visitors to hunters, fishermen. All those groups have different, sometimes common interests, but they're all coming from different perspectives. And so we have to look at those uses and see where they're compatible or where they're not compatible. And then the uniqueness, special attributes, and availability of resources. Yep.
So back on number 3, it says suitability of lands for proposed uses. So is that above the high water mark, or is that just still below the high water mark?
No, so all of our jurisdiction is below the high water mark.
So if the lake is full, then there's no land.
So if the lake's full, there's land underneath it, right? And so when we say sovereign lands, we're talking about the shoreline and the lake bed, but we have regulatory authority and we manage for uses on that land, so on the bed, over the bed, or under the bed.
So who has authority to govern the actual lands above the high water mark?
So generally, you're generally above the high water mark. In most of the Bear Lake area, it's going to be local government, so it's going to be county and city. So, all right. So, how many of you are familiar with our 2009 management plan? How many of you ever heard of a management plan? I have a few. That's good. That's better than last time I asked that question, I think. So we had the first management plan that we did on Bear Lake, we completed in 2009. I think it was a 2 or 3 year process. It exists. It's there. It's available on our website, which is on the pamphlet and the card if you want to look at it. But it's been 10 years. And in that plan, it identifies that in 10 years we need to revisit it and update it. We have a lot of new information with Bear Lake. We have a lot better information on everything from topography and habitat and recreation use and those sorts of things. So we can bring that new information in, as well as take a look and see what the current state is of the lands and of those associated resources compared to what we were looking at 10 years ago, because things change over time. And then also incorporate changes in state laws, rules, and regulations. As I'm sure many of you know, we actually have seen several changes in state law and rules and regulations at Bear Lake since 2009. In 2009, there were no beach launching permits the way that we do them now. Motorized access was restricted more and then opened back up. So through House Bill 333 in I think 2013 or 14, somebody else probably knows that better than I do, to House Bill 140 a few years ago, it's made those changes, and we've changed our management plan accordingly, but it's kind of time to bring that together, get it into the new plan and move forward. Update classifications and clarify allowable uses. We'll talk a little bit more about how we classify sovereign lands, and we'll talk about allowable uses as well, but those also change. We didn't see boat lifts on the lake 10 years ago, but we have them now. We were just talking about short-term rentals and that sort of thing, which I don't have any jurisdiction over, but things change at Bear Lake and those uses change, so it's to incorporate those. And then one thing that we've done in other plans that we'd really like to do at Bear Lake is integrate a lake level management approach. And what that means is the sovereign land resources, as well as the access to them and the uses, all change depending on where that lake level's at, right? So as a lot of you are adjacent owners, it's very different when we're at 5922 or 5920 than it is when we're at 5910. And so this will be an attempt to kind of better acknowledge that and then identify how our management might change accordingly. And then go to the 2009 CMP at the end has several different goals and objectives that kind of guide us moving forward with projects. And it's everything from weed management and habitat to public access, recreation, and that sort of thing. And so we'll revisit those, take a look at what we have done over the last 10 years, take a look at what we haven't done and maybe why we haven't done it, make sure those are still relevant, and then reformulate those management goals and objectives moving forward. So we'll get a little bit into kind of an overview of the process, but this gets back to like where does the Army Corps of Engineers come in. But this diagram kind of shows, what we're looking at just as we start out. And right now we're in, initial phases, so we're really information gathering at this point. We have a planning team that we've put together, and that includes folks from cities and counties, state agencies. We have stakeholder groups that involve federal government agencies. We're here meeting with you guys as members of the general public, also adjacent landowners and lessees. So we do have people that hold leases at Bear Lake, and then tribes and other groups. So Bear Lake Watch is also on our planning team. But these are all different kind of lenses you can look through it at Bear Lake, right? And they're all going to have different perspectives. And so we're reaching out to various people and groups within each of these to try to bring their input into the plan. And then, so I guess, like with the Army Corps of Engineers, for example, like we'll reach out to them. I work with them fairly regularly. They're not on our planning team, but they will be notified of what we're doing and kind of things moving forward. So sovereign lands classifications. So all of our sovereign lands where we have management plans use similar classifications. And these are kind of mandated to us through administrative code. But the gist of it, so we have 6 classes. There's really 5 that we use very often. The first 2 are going to be related more towards resource development. At Bear Lake, we're generally talking about recreation development. We don't do mineral leasing currently, or we don't have bridges and we don't have utilities that are running across the lake at this point. So generally when we're talking about resource development at Bear Lake, we're talking about recreation-focused development. And that's existing and potential. Class 3 and 4 areas, we don't typically see on sovereign lands at the point that we actually have a management plan in place. Because open for consideration of any use is broad enough, we usually have a more detailed management strategy for an area. And then resource inventory analysis is a lot of what we're doing through this process. Classes 5 and 6. So if you think about Bear Lake, a lot of the class 1 and class 2 areas are where your homes are if you're adjacent. So most of those developed areas through Garden City, a lot around the south end, are primarily class 1 and class 2 areas. On the east side of the lake is where we start to see the class 5 and class 6 areas, which are primarily for resource preservation. So either potential or existing again. But the thing I want to point out here is you can look at these classification areas on the shoreline and things change a little bit in between them, but I want to be clear that it doesn't mean that recreation or no other uses happen in class 5 and class 6 areas. It also doesn't mean that it's a free-for-all in class 1 and class 2 areas, because there's still resources there that we need to protect.
Could you just explain what that means in plain English?
Which part?
I mean, I look at all of them, they all seem to say the same thing.
Okay.
So if I'm looking at 1 and 2, existing resource development.
Yeah.
Resource development, what exactly are you talking about?
So 1 and 2 are very similar. The easiest way is probably to look at the examples. So class 1, for example, is like the Bear Lake State Park Marina, like that area is already developed. there's a marina structure on top of it, that would be a class 1 area. It's already there. When we look at class 2 areas, those might be areas that are adjacent to a class 1 area that may further develop in the future, or they may be areas where we have
Just define
adjacent
development.
land
That's what
uses.
I'm wondering.
Yeah,
What
so
are some examples of development?
So in the 2009 plan, we actually call it recreational development. But it's typically where you're going to have fewer restrictions when it comes to recreational uses. So for example, boat ramps is a good example. We allow individual boat ramps in class 1 areas and class 2 areas, but we don't allow them in class 5 or class 6 areas unless there's a showing of extraordinary need. Does that make sense? Like our class 5 and class 6 areas on the east side would be where we have sensitive spawning habitat. And we really don't have a pressure for a recreational use or a
So
developed
you're talking
recreational
about
use.
Boat ramps, boat launches.
Mhm. Yeah, a lot of times it's that infrastructure. Is that a little more clear?
Yes.
Okay.
Is Rendezvous Beach a class 1 then?
I believe it is a class 1, yes. We can look, do we have a map with management classifications? Okay, so we can talk about that a little bit after too, if you're interested in specific areas. Any more questions on that before I move forward? So this might help make help it make a little more sense or make it way more confusing. We'll see. So going back to those things that we're looking at. Okay. When we look at these different classifications that we're trying to fit different pieces of sovereign land into, we're looking at the resources that are there, we're looking at the uses that are there, the uses that could be there, and essentially what we're doing, and that can include adjacent uses, so a lot of the area between, through the Garden City area that you can see on the map is developed, so there's homes and businesses and that sort of thing, and so we're looking at that as well as the shoreline, and then we'll determine which management class that should fall within. So in most of these developed areas, they are going to be the class 2 areas. So we kind of take the information you're seeing on the left side and then apply it to the shoreline and come up with those classifications. And that's one area that we certainly would be looking for feedback. You can look at the 2009 CMP, which I have a map of the classifications right here if you're interested afterward, and kind of see, because we'll be using that as a baseline. But then, okay, great. But then also if you're interested in specific areas or you want to put feedback on any of our boards up here about a certain area, you're certainly welcome to do that. Questions? Okay. So once we've classified that according to the resources and some of the uses there, then this is something that also did not exist in the 2009 plan, but we plan on doing for this plan. I think this is really helpful for me from my perspective, but I think hopefully it'll also be helpful for adjacent landowners and other stakeholders to know what kinds of things we do allow and what kind of things we might not allow, or what kind of things you might need to get additional permission for. And all this really is we identify each of those management classes along the top, and then we come up with common uses that we see at the lake. And then it's just a simple matrix as far as, so for example here, A is allowable, P is potentially allowable, and N is not allowable. And this is just an example, I just made it up, so don't hold me to anything too much. But so we'll go to community ramps, for example. So if you're interested in putting in a ramp, you can go look and see, okay, I want to put in an individual ramp. I can see that that's allowable in class 1 and class 2 areas. And it doesn't mean that you just go in, dig it up, pour concrete, and don't worry about it. You still have to come and get a permit. But generally they're allowable in those areas. Class 5 areas, it's going to be potentially allowable, so there may be more restrictions as far as where you can put those in or how you have to put them in order to mitigate an impact to a resource. And then in class 6 areas, for example, they're generally not going to be allowable. So if we were going to do it there, we would actually have to change the management plan. Does that make sense?
So for those of us on the east shore who already have our ramps in, Are we in class 5 there, that we had to have the permits, which we did,
So,
with the Corps of Engineers and so on?
so I know where your place is, and you're in a class 2 area. So it is
Okay.
generally allowable for a permanent individual ramp. Most of the class 6 areas, class 5 and class 6 areas at Bear Lake do not have adjacent homes at this point. Some of the new developments that are proposed will actually be adjacent to areas that are currently class 5 and class 6, and so they will deal with those restrictions. But when we dealt with boat ramps a few years ago, we did an amendment to the 2009 plan to incorporate that. We did kind of grandfather in existing ramps. Is there another?
Well, you kind of answered part of my question in that we've always had a ramp at our house. I mean, we've always, watched there. And a couple of years ago, they were talking about not grandfathering that and making us get all kinds of permits and fining us and, even small docks and stuff that have been there forever and ever.
Yeah.
And from what I'm seeing here is that should now be allowable and we shouldn't have to worry about somebody coming and telling us we have to rip it out, right?
Generally, yes. So I can't just say you can, go for whatever you want, right?
These are things that have, been there 20 years, 30, 40 years,
Yeah. And so what we did with those, and it is true, so we did grandfather the current ramps in. Docks and buoys, we generally do 3-year permits on. Ramps, we generally do 10-year permits on. So anything that is on sovereign land for more than, I think it's 72 hours, you generally are gonna need a permit for. We try to make that process as painless as possible. That is something that we will be looking at through this plan process as well. But we permit buoys and docks all the time. We've permitted several ramps since we did that amendment. Yeah.
Can you give us an example of a 5 and a 6 area around the lake?
Yep, 5 and 6, so a lot of like Cisco Beach, that area on the east side where we have a lot of the cobble, is critical spawning habitat, so that gets lumped into 5 and 6 areas. We also don't have a lot of beach use over there, other than the folks at the state parks. There's not a lot of demand for infrastructure like docks and buoys, so those are typically class 5 and class 6 areas. Most of the west shoreline through Garden City, where we have a lot of the sand beaches, we do have a lot of demand for recreation. We have a lot of folks that do want permits there. We don't have the spawning substrate. We do have some wetland areas. Most of those areas are currently class 1 and class 2 though.
What about the lake shore between Garden City and Lake Town?
It varies. So between, well, that's a big area.
Well, from Gus's to Lake Town.
So from Gus,
From the rest area, say, from Gus's to the
Yep.
rest area.
So from Gus Rich Point, and we can look at maps and talk about it, but it's a good example. From Gus Rich, there's, I believe, a class 1 area right there at the RV park where they have the marina, and there's a permit there, or a lease there for a recreational business. As you move south, we have class 2 areas because we have a lot of recreational demand. We also don't have a lot of sensitive resources there. But there's a narrow little strip of a class 5 area because as the water's up, and we'll talk about this when we talk about lake levels a little bit, when the water's high like it is now and it's up on the rocks, it's spawning habitat, right? But as the water recedes and it's not on the rocks and it's out on the sand, then it's not nearly as sensitive. So that area, a lot of that area is actually split. Does that make sense? If we want to talk about specific areas, I'm happy to do that. But I think, does this seem like something that's useful?
Absolutely.
Then, I mean, that's definitely part of what I would like to see out of
Much clearer
Out
than
of
we've seen in the past.
changing the management plan, is to make it a little bit more accessible and make it so there's really some useful information for you folks as well. So another thing, and this is kind of what we started to talk about, but is the lake level approach. So the 2009 CMP in the goals and objectives buried a couple levels down. There's just a real general objective that says we will pay attention to water levels and adjust accordingly, is essentially what it says. Water levels at Bear Lake affect a lot. And so this is kind of an acknowledgement of that, and then also trying to figure out how we should respond to those changing lake levels. I'll be really clear and hopefully stay there, that we're not talking about, we have no control over what that water level is, right? That's another agency, those are water rights, water resources, different processes. So I don't have any more say over what the elevation of Bear Lake is than any of you do. But we have to respond to those changes, right? And so we can use that area from Gus Rich Point down to Rendezvous as an example. Gus Rich Point is,
The end of Garden City,
yeah, it's south of Garden City.
south of.
Do you know where Ideal Beach Resort is?
Is that called? No,
Yeah.
I just never heard it called that, we've heard it called Sweetwater, so.
That's just a little.
Is it?
Okay. I'd be happy to point it to you, but that area where the highway comes out is right along the lake, right? So when that area, we just talked about habitat, right? When the water's up in the rocks, we have spawning habitat there. The water comes down, there's really not a lot of spawning habitat there. The other thing, so looking at recreation there, and this is something that we spend a lot of time with because that's one of our heaviest used areas. When the water level's up, you can't get vehicles onto the beach, and they're parked alongside the road right on the white stripe. It's 55, 60 miles an hour. We can't get nearly as many people out there, and so we need to adjust the way we're managing that area, whether it's motorized access or parking or that sort of thing, based on when it's up versus when it's down. And we can get vehicles out there, and we can get them off the highway and parked out on the beach. Right, and so it's acknowledging kind of things like that. So those water elevations affect all of these things listed here and really a lot of aspects of the lake. Some people like it high, some people like it low. We don't get into that as much as how we're gonna respond to it in different areas.
Well, when it's high and you say that there's spawning going on, you don't get your people out of there, right?
No. So when the lake's high and up in those rocks, we generally don't exclude access to sovereign land outright in any way. We might limit motorized access in an area because of that resource or the impact that would have on that resource. We might limit mowing vegetation in an area based on a resource. And all those things hopefully get kind of spelled out more in this plan. Any questions? Sound like a good idea? Do water levels affect what you guys do at Bear Lake?
Absolutely.
So after
What kind of fish are spawning in these areas?
Bonneville Cisco, we're on the other side. There is some trout spawning. We'll look at, I'm not your aquatic biologist. He is on our planning team, so that's helpful. Hopefully we bring a lot of those folks together. Okay. I was gonna say, so that was one of the uses that changed based on water levels that I wasn't necessarily expecting. In 2017, we had a 12-foot increase in the lake level in a year, which was a record. Yeah, it was great.
It's fabulous.
Right? Adjacent landowner? Yes. Right. Day use visitors? Anybody? Where'd the beach go?
Yeah.
Right? Bear Lake beaches were gone. But I got a huge number of phone calls from folks who had rolling docks and floating docks that they now wanted to put out because we hadn't seen water levels like that in a long time, and they'd had them sitting there, and they're really not that usable when the lake's 1,000 feet from your place and the lake bed is so flat. But as soon as we had that water come up to 5922, we started getting phone calls because uses and demand for uses had changed. So that's one of my examples. Management goals and objectives, and I won't read through this all or anything, but we'll have management goals and objectives for ecological values, community values such as recreation, a number of different things. You can look at the 2009 plan if you want to kind of see what some of those look like. But we'll be revisiting those to make sure that they're still relevant for the lake based on the resources that we're seeing as they are now, as well as kind of where we're moving forward and how things have changed.
When, in goal 1 and 2, when you talk about those objectives along the Bear River, how far does that extend beyond the lake?
Okay.
Bear River.
So this says Bear River because that was one of our more recent management plans, so we borrowed it from that. So we do claim sovereign land along the Bear River. That portion that's in Utah, we don't claim it in Rich County, but we do claim it in Cache and Box Elder counties. But this was just taken from that. Any question on those? But that's another good area for input. So if you'll look at those, let us know what you think, or if you have things that you think we should be doing that maybe we're not. That's a good area to provide comments on the boards or give us written comments, or we'll talk about some other methods.
You know, I read the word native habitats, but, you know, as we've said several times this evening, that the lake level fluctuates.
Mhm.
So you get different native habitats at different, so how do you, I mean, that's kind of a,
Absolutely.
yeah, so how do you manage for that?
That's what we're trying to figure out. I'm open to ideas. Yeah, no, it definitely changes. It's a lake. It changes on its own. The lake level fluctuations definitely make it change as well. Like I said, the spawning habitat is one example. Shoreline habitat, avian habitat, wetlands, those change. When the lake's out, there's a whole lot of land area all of a sudden that's exposed. And there's all sorts of different types of vegetation, good and bad, in that land area. And so how we manage changes considerably. What I did in terms of vegetation and weed management and that sort of thing this past year, the past 2 years, is very different than what I was doing 4 years ago.
Will you go into what's different about that? I mean, because that as a adjacent landowner, what's different in the last 2 years about the weed and the growth in the lake bed and low water times?
So low water times, we have a lot more area to cover, which changes it actually makes it easier for me to get to a lot of areas because I can get equipment in there, but at the same time, I have a lot more area to cover. Water level comes up, it actually covers in a lot of that vegetation. It's gonna drown a lot of it out. Different species are gonna be present based on the topography of the lake bed and where the water level is. So, and we did a lot of work with Phragmites. I think that we were successful there, right? But it doesn't hurt anything. The lake also comes up over top of a lot of that right now, right? When it goes back out, we're gonna have to start getting a lot more aggressive with Phragmites again. Right now, in a lot of areas with the water up in the rock on the east side, I'm able to focus on some of those and some different weed species. Not necessarily my management, because I don't mow, but I would say adjacent landowners, a lot of times we have allowed you to mow on the shoreline. If that lake level's low and you have a huge flat area full of vegetation before you get to the water, we're gonna see a lot more people wanting to mow, right, and remove vegetation. When it's up, like especially on the south side and the southeast side, it's water, sand, somebody's yard. And so there's a lot of areas that I really don't have that much of a weed problem right now.
So 6 or 8 years ago, we were encouraged not to mess with the weeds, and now there's a little bit more availability to mow weeds. Dredge that out, or
So generally, and it's something that we probably will, well, that we definitely will address in the management plan as far as what we allow and what we don't as far as mowing. Generally, we've been open to adjacent landowners mowing vegetation in front of their places on the shoreline with certain restrictions. And so I've issued letters of authorization. It's been kind of common knowledge. I think this will more directly address it,
So you have
just to
get a letter of
clarify.
authorization? I mean, the
So-
previous thing said that it was allowable.
Yeah, so just because it says it's allowable doesn't mean you don't have to talk to anybody about it, right?
Okay.
It's like a boat ramp might be allowable in a class 1 area, but you better get a permit, yeah.
Your
Yep.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So plenty of people mowed adjacent to their land and they didn't have a letter of authorization. It was kind of common knowledge that we allowed that with restrictions. But if you're out there mowing and you're tearing everything up and disturbing soil and that sort of thing, then that's going to be a different story. I hope that by putting that into the plan, we've got a list of things that I'm working on right now as far as what's in the 2009 CMP and what wasn't in the 2009 CMP that needs to be. And I think mowing will be one of those, just to clarify what's allowed, when it's allowed, and what's not allowed. Does that make sense? And then as far as weed management on the shoreline, I'd be happy to talk to you about that. We do quite a bit. I can't really authorize adjacent landowners to spray chemical on the shoreline, but if you let me know about weed issues, we will do what we can. So I'm going to gloss over this a little bit to keep moving, but best management practices. So similarly, so we might, to continue with that, have a best management practice that addresses vegetation removal or mowing on the shoreline. And we'll have a list of things that we're going to be looking for in order to authorize that use, or what's going to be allowable and what's not. So we'll identify the common uses, and then we'll develop, what we're expecting as far as ways that we can facilitate that use, but make sure that we're protecting those resources. So mitigate the impacts. Does that make sense? Okay, so a timeline, because this is a lot of work. And there's a number of opportunities that I want to point out to all of you to participate in this. So right now, as I said, we're pretty early in, so we're kind of in that first stage. So September, December 2019, we're pretty much information gathering at this point. We're not saying this is what we're going to do, this is what we should do, that's what's, we might say this is an issue we're going to address, but we haven't necessarily developed how we're going to address it yet, right? We don't have a written plan at this point. So public involvement and scoping, we did a meeting in Bear Lake in September. This is our second meeting. It's not a formal comment period, so you may not get a direct response, but we are seeking your input and comments right now. And then we will start writing the plan as we get into late winter and early spring. So that's January to July 2020. Develop the draft of the new CMP. Once we have that draft, then we go into another kind of phase of public involvement, and we'll put that draft out there, and we'll send you notices. We'll put it on the website, and we'll say, go look at it, see what we got right, see what we got wrong, see what we didn't even get at all, and let us know. And that will be a formal comment period. So if you submit comments at that point, you will get a response, or they will be addressed in the plan. It doesn't mean that we can necessarily do everything that everybody wants, because we all know that's impossible, but we will take those comments, address those comments, and use that information. So then October to November, we'll be looking at those comments. So we have a draft, get all of your information. We will come back and revisit that draft and change it as needed to address those comments. And this happened, I'll give an example. When we did our boat ramp amendment a couple of years ago, how many people were around for that and are involved in that? So we actually released that, right? So we released a plan amendment to address boat ramps. And I think like a day or two after we released it, I just started getting phone calls. And there was an issue that we hadn't addressed. Like, we just hadn't considered it. We hadn't thought of it. Nobody had brought it up in the early stages of the planning process, and it was significant enough. We pulled that draft back, stopped the comment period, made changes, and then resubmitted it. So we will generally try to be responsive to those comments. We do consider them. We certainly want your feedback.
Now, you said that the draft will be on the website. Is that what's on the front of here?
I'll talk about that in just a second. Yeah, it will be there, but I'll show you, we have a tool on our website. So you can go there, you can see the 2009 CMP. We also have a tool there for you to comment now. And then you'll have a similar way to comment there when we have a draft. And then, I guess, trying to see where I am. I'm looking at this screen like expecting something to change, but so our target to have the whole process complete will be June of 2021. So it is a fairly long process, but it's a lot of work. It may not be complete by then. It may be complete earlier than then if we really get lucky, but that's kind of our overall timeline. And once we have that final CMP, we'll put it out again. We will send notices again, and there's a consistency review period once we adopt that plan, where you can go in and provide comments one more time and tell us if there's anything that we did wrong in terms of doing anything inconsistent with our rules and regulations regarding how we do these plans. So you have an opportunity right now, right? So kind of this winter into December, January, February, you can send comments at any time. The further into that you get, the further along we're going to be, so we'd like them sooner than later. You'll have another opportunity to comment as soon as we have a draft released, which is when you'll get a better picture of what we're actually doing. And then another opportunity in that consistency review after we adopt a plan. And then, so the 2009 CMP, I have a copy somewhere. It is available online. You can look at that. There's a PDF up there. A lot of folks, even on our planning team, are not that familiar with it. Things have changed a lot in terms of technology and how we can share information in the last 10 years as well. So these are kind of some of the things we're hoping to have after this planning process. So we'll have the PDF of the plan, we'll have a hard copy of the plan, it'll be a print thing, but in addition we'll have what they call an Esri story map. We'll see a little bit of what that looks like in a minute potentially, and then we'll have a spatial data viewer. But again, it's trying to make this more accessible. So you don't have to have a paper copy of this plan on your, on your shelf to look at what the requirement is for a boat dock. You can go to our website, go into this story map, get information about sovereign lands, get information about our permitting requirements, look at specific locations, and do that sort of thing through our website. So hopefully that's, kind of that last objective of updating the plan now is to make it more accessible and more user-friendly. I know that I use the story map for the Bear River a lot more than I actually open the plan document. So how to participate, we talked about it a little bit, but thank you all for coming to this public meeting. We will have more public meetings once we have that draft together. And so it's always a good place to get here. We can talk about things back and forth. I'm always happy to do that. But attend these meetings and give us feedback. So if you have a minute after we're done, if you provide some comments or talk to us about how to best do that, we'd appreciate it. We also have these comment forums. So if you want to put pen to paper, this is a good way to do it. Especially when we get to the formal comment period, it's a lot easier for us to take written comments than it is just remember what we talked about, right? So feel free to write your comments, whatever they might be, sovereign lands related, adjacent, doesn't mean we can do about anything about it, but it'll be considered.
That is, that form in electronic form on the website then? So you could make comments by going to the Bear Lake CMP.
Yeah, so the website does not have that exact same form. What it has is a map where you can drop a pin and write a comment next to the pin.
Oh, okay.
For a specific
So-
location. And if you don't want to do a specific location, you can drop a pin and just say no specific location. Here's my comment. You can also email Matt, Laura, or myself as well if you'd rather.
Yep. And I have a whole stack of cards somewhere for anybody who doesn't have one.
Actually, those boards over there really simplify part of that process and the different things that can be addressed. And so if there was something on the website similar to that where people could make
Yeah,
comments,
check it out and
it would be
see.
great.
I think it'll be helpful because
Okay.
you can attach comments to specific locations there.
Good.
Yeah. We'll look at that. I'll go into the website here in a minute and show you exactly what she's talking about and how you can put a comment on there, because it's a really good tool for us, because there's no confusion as far as they're talking about this specific area or this specific issue, whether it's a safety issue or a navigational hazard or a weed problem or whatever it may be. It's a really good tool. And that's actually number 3 on my list. So use the forms for written comments. You can also email me or Laura or any of us on the planning team. We'll take that as well. And then the project website, which I'll go to here in a minute. For some reason, I have to like close out of the presentation to do that, so bear with me for a minute. Are there questions while I'm getting reset up here?
So Garden City at one point in time was getting a permit to develop more beach along part of their city. Has that died, or what's going on there?
So Garden City has a current permit they have had for several years. It runs from just south of the marina down to almost to Blue Water Beach on that west side. It allows them to do certain things. It doesn't necessarily allow them to do anything beyond that. They have a permit with the Army Corps of Engineers as well to groom some of the shoreline in that area. It also allows them to manage parking. A lot of their access points are actually their access points, so I don't really have a lot to do with their gates because they're above the high water mark, as an example. But they have a current permit. We could talk about that.
How far up does that go toward the marina?
It's right about,
By the KOA or?
is it 200 north or 250 north?
I think it starts at 200 north and then just.
It's, can you see me zoom in here? It goes to, and this is just from memory, so don't hold it, but it's right in here somewhere,
Okay. Yeah.
right in that area somewhere south. But when we do permits, and I'll be very clear about this, and if anybody tells you otherwise, tell them to call me. But generally when we do permits, they're non-exclusive. So it doesn't mean that Garden City can keep you from using the beach in that area. Right, it might allow them to do certain things as far as management of that area, but it doesn't mean that I turn, or we turn all of our jurisdiction over to Garden City and they now manage that and we don't pay attention. Is that clear? So like Blue Water Beach is the same way. You can boat up to Blue Water Beach, park your boat, hop out on the beach, state sovereign land, public access, non-exclusive, no problem. Doesn't mean you can go use their facilities, right? It doesn't mean you can get through the Garden City gate because it's not my gate, but you can use that area. Does that make sense? So this is kind of that story map tool that I said that I was using on the Bear River a lot more than the plan. This doesn't have nearly as much in it as it will have because we're building that as we go. But you can go on here and get some information about sovereign lands, about permits, that sort of thing. As far as participating, so let me just scroll through a little bit. So click through these if you want to participate. So if you want to comment through this, hit this tab, and it'll actually take you to a little bit different website. But you pop right over here. We'll see if I can get in that. And then this is our tool to take those comments. So this line is approximate, so don't get too worried about it. You can switch if you want to find your house and you can't. Where's my layers? There we go. So you can find specific areas. So like that's the Azure Cove Marina. If you want to leave a comment, just come down to this little button right here. and you can choose one of these. So if your comment's related to ecosystem resources, to water, be it water quality, water levels, anything to do with that, community, which would be recreation. If you don't know, stick it under other, put it under whatever you need to, just please go ahead and give us some comments. But you hit one of these, and then you can click on the map. So I'll say, let's go ecosystem, and Azure Cove Marina, and it'll bring up this little point, and I can put in my name, or you can not put in your name, I believe, if you want to be anonymous, and I will say, this is a fun one for me lately, Eurasian water milfoil, which is a new weed species we have, which I'm not excited about. You can upload a photo, you can upload something else if you want to, and then you just go ahead and submit that comment. Right, and then I should be able to go in there and see it. So we'll receive all these. So it's a pretty good tool. I think it's really handy. It makes it really clear for us where you're talking about, because, for example, you guys didn't know what I was talking to with Gus Ridge Point because you call it somewhere else. A lot of that area actually, from Gus Ridge Point to Rendezvous Beach, I've seen show up on a couple of maps as Hobo Beach. That was a new one for me that just started showing up a few years ago, but I've already seen it in like plan documents with UDOT. So this really allows us to kind of be more specific. And then pictures are great. So if you have certain issues, if you have weed problems, if you have, if there's a navigational hazard that we're not aware of or not doing anything about, please go ahead and submit those in there. Are there any questions about that? And if you have any trouble with this, give me a call and I'll pretend I know how to do it. We'll work through it. So let me go back and get you our contact information, and then we'll open up for kind of questions and comments. If you have the time, I'm happy to stay around and talk as long as we have a room. Please do. There's some comments up here which I'm happy to see, but feel free to put more up there now. Fill out your comment forms. Do we have any questions we want to talk about as a group? Anything we haven't covered? Are you thoroughly confused and ready to go home?
How often are you at the lake taking care of business?
It depends. So like I said, I work with Bear Lake and the Bear River and occasionally the Great Salt Lake, so I'm not there all the time. During the summer, I try to be there at least once and usually twice a week. During the winter, I might be there once every couple weeks. During the summer, I also have seasonal employees up there, and I have a lot of people I talk to that are eyes and ears for me. So I think I got 2 or 3 phone calls from people today about things that I'm not seeing, but they are. So, any other questions?
What's the, we have the state parks, is there jurisdiction at the high level mark and you're just below, or do you guys share that, or how does that integration work with you guys?
That's a good question. It works a little bit differently depending on what area, because some of them were done a long time ago, and some of them have been done more recently as far as how we authorized what they're doing below the high water mark. So the marina, for example, is what we call a dedication. So we dedicate that land to state parks to manage as a marina, right? On the east side parks, they actually have a permit that allows them to manage that area and allows them to do certain things. But their ownership stops at that high water mark, just like an adjacent landowners would.
And what about on the Idaho side? Is your jurisdiction just in Utah, or you have also on the Idaho side as well?
Fortunately or unfortunately, I'm just in Utah. So we are trying to work more and more with Idaho all the time. We have a representative from Idaho Department of Lands. They're structured a little bit differently than we are, but they're on our stakeholder list, and we have one of their folks on our planning team for the CMP. We've started to work together a lot more on weed issues, especially recently, those sorts of things, because it is one lake, but our jurisdiction ends at the line.
Do they tend to have alignment with your views of the lake management, or are they very different, or getting closer, have been far? I don't know.
You know, I think a lot of times we hear so much, like I hear so much from people on the Utah side, what Idaho's allowing and not allowing, that a lot of our conversations are trying to figure out what what they're allowing or what I'm allowing, and trying to figure out really how we're both managing. If you look at strictly like the rules and the regulations, I think you'll find more similarities than you will differences. But as far as how we go about management and our level of management, I think that's quite a bit different.
Do they have a comprehensive management plan or its equivalent?
They don't currently. They're actually talking about it though so I've probably talked more to Idaho Department of Lands in the last year and a half than I did in the preceding 3. And probably honestly in the last 2 months more than I did in the preceding 4. So, but they are talking about doing a comprehensive management plan for the Idaho side of the lake that involves the county. So they're looking at it, but they haven't done it yet.
Matt, just to clarify, so from the high water mark, if it's within the state park, for example, like the concessionaire area, both at Rendezvous and at the Bear Lake Marina, if it's on state property, basically you look for the state rangers then to address the issues more than you becoming involved.
Yeah, so generally, I mean, they have 4 rangers and I have me, right? So if they're in the parks areas, I'm generally looking to them to deal with those things. It doesn't mean that I'm ignoring it. So if their concessionaire goes out and digs up the beach, I'm going to have a few things to say about that. But, you know, law enforcement and the concessionaires are operating under agreements with state parks, because specifically with Rendezvous and the marina, we've dedicated that land area to them for those purposes.
And that area in between Gus Rich's Point and Rendezvous, which is majority of, quite a long area, are there issues as far as the number of people that can be on those beaches? I know as far as driving, it's only supposed to be, 50 yards from their entrance that they're allowed to drive on the beach. I think that was the last thing the legislature came up with. But
Yes.
Is that monitored? Is it patrolled? Is it enforced?
It is,
So
to the extent we can, right? We can't be everywhere at once.
Right.
And I don't carry a gun or a badge, nor do I really want to. I appreciate those folks who do. We work with Rich County Sheriff's Department,
Okay.
and I actually contract them, and they bring on extra people in the summer to help us with those areas. It changes a lot based on the water levels, honestly. The last couple years, we haven't had to have as much law enforcement, especially in those areas. When that water goes out and we have that huge beach area, we have more motorized vehicles, we have more people, then we will have a lot more law enforcement there. We also work with, so the state parks rangers, they're on the lake, they have authority as far as boating rules and boating safety. They're fairly well versed in our sovereign lands rules as well. We try to work back and forth together. They help us out a lot. So does Division of Wildlife Conservation officers up there. So hopefully we all kind of work together and coordinate. But there is, we can't enforce everything all the time, just pure numbers.
I'm concerned, obviously, about the quagga mussel issues.
Yes.
Will there be any more checkpoints, or, a lot of times when you come in there late at night, there's you can't have somebody there 24/7, but
Yeah.
it's a worry.
And that's another thing. I mean, along with beach launching permits, which beach launching permits were to some extent a response to that threat, right? Nobody was talking about quagga mussels and zebra mussels in 2009. They're very much a thing for us now, and so that is something that will be addressed in this plan that was not addressed in the last one. The check stations specifically are actually run by Division of Wildlife, and so that's not necessarily me. But again, we try to work together as much as we can. So as far as whether they continue or not, that would depend on kind of their strategy in that area, but I don't see any sign of them going away. But like I said, so I don't have jurisdiction over their checkpoints, but I think that that is completely fair game to go ahead and throw comments in on this process. So those are the sort of things that are, you know, not necessarily our jurisdiction, but still useful, you know, to this planning process. Any others? Yep.
Just first of all, wanted to thank your division for the work getting rid of the Phragmite weeds that were so invasive. And now apparently we have another new invasive weed. And what have you figured out so far on that one?
Okay. So we have a number of things that we're treating. I probably treat 12 to 15 different weed species at Bear Lake on a regular basis. So those are tamarisk, Russian olive, spotted knapweed, Dyer's woad, thistle, I think I already said tamarisk, but there's several that we managed for very recently, and I think that there's been some news stories about it. Idaho, so were actually doing weed surveys, and they found a weed called Eurasian water milfoil on the Idaho side, and we didn't have a known occurrence of this weed within a couple 100 miles of Bear Lake. So it was actually, they deal with it a lot more in the northern end of Idaho, and so they were more familiar with it. They had somebody there that knew what it was pretty quickly. As soon as they found it, it got on our radar, so they sent out a notification to actually Utah Department of Ag and their weeds folks, who then called us. So we're pretty early in the process. That was in October that we became aware of it. We went down, we had folks from wildlife and I and some others, you know, went and looked at it. They showed us how to identify it. It did not take me very long to find it on the Utah side. So it is in a number of areas along the shoreline. I think there's probably 6 or 7 kind of concentrated areas. They actually tend to be in kind of protected areas, so it's in almost every marina on the lake. So from the state marina to Azure Cove to the ideal beach marinas, it's in those areas. It's in a couple other protected areas. Our first step was to go out and find it, and then we did some surveying with Department of Ag. So there were 3 of us in kayaks for 3 or 4 days. We covered the area from the Idaho line on the west side around the south end and up to First Point, looking for it and mapping it. So that's been kind of the first step. We're putting that together, so we have a little bit of a report on what we found that's being finalized, and then we will be developing a strategy to address it over the winter.
Thank you, thank you.
We do what we can. I don't know if we'll win them all, but that is one that makes us nervous. The invasive species, you know, we talk about quagga all the time, but there's several others that can also have a negative impact on the lake. So, yeah, and that's one that we just weren't aware of. And that's where I say, if you see stuff that you don't know what it is, or it's new on the shoreline and you want somebody to come look at it, I am more than happy to do that or send someone.
So if we know where a pocket of something is, we can just drop you a note or something?
Yeah, you can put it on that map right now. But yeah, you can give me a call and I'll come check it out and see what we can do. I actually do that fairly frequently in the summer. A lot of times it won't be me that shows up to do something about it, but I can send a seasonal over and we can see what it is. Any other questions?
Yeah, just a quick one. First, thanks for all your hard work on behalf of those of us who have property on the lake. And I know it's not your direct jurisdiction, but philosophically, what's the goal for the lake level? Is it to try and maintain it at a higher level? Or is it truly just whatever happens, happens? I mean, this year, I think we had one of the biggest snow packs we've had in a very long time. And, you know, the lake came up 2 or 3 feet, but it didn't fill. Didn't necessarily expect it to, but just philosophically, is the goal now to try and keep more water in it, or is that not true?
Well, so a number of things affect the lake level, right? There's how much water comes in, and I'm not the expert on this by any means, so what I'm saying is kind of my take on it. Nor do we have any jurisdiction over it. But you have, the amount of water that comes in and the snowpack and the stream flows and those sorts of things, but you also have a demand on that water, right? And we have water rights that govern that at Bear Lake. So the top 20 feet is a storage reservoir, right? And there's a water right to store that water in there, and then there's contracts for delivering that downstream. And since the Bear River, which it's going through, and it's part of the Bear River system, goes through Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming, right? There's the Bear River Commission, and it's all kind of laid out within the Bear River Compact how that works between the states. And then there's the settlement agreement that talks about how water allocations are done based on that lake level agreement. It's pretty complex, but it's not just, I guess, willy-nilly. There's not just somebody turning on the valve or turning off the valve, as they see fit. So like this last year, a lot of my read on and what I've heard, we had a good snowpack, but we didn't have as much precipitation, right? So we had a good amount of water come in, but we also had a high demand for water going out. 2012, we had water, or 2017, we had water everywhere. A couple years before that, we didn't have very good snowpack at all, and we actually only ended up dropping about 1.5 feet. And that was because we got really good rains in August and September. So it reduced that demand. So it's fairly complex, but it's not just, somebody making that call. Does that answer it a little bit? So I don't know that there's an overall objective at this point. That would be somebody besides me that could talk more in depth about it.
Just a low comment on that a couple of years ago, Pacific Corps kind of regulates how much water goes out.
Yeah, they do.
And they changed,
So Pacific Corps has a contract to deliver certain amounts of water to different folks downstream, right? And so that, in combination with the settlement agreement, is going to determine what
power on
goes out.
letting it out, letting the
Yeah.
water out. And a couple of years ago, they kind of changed their winter plan where they would let the water out in the fall and early winter, and then hope that water came in to fill. And now they're holding on to it longer. They're not letting it out right away. They're holding it on to it longer so that we should be seeing higher levels of water a little bit more consistently. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Because they aren't letting so much out in the fall and the winter.
Yeah, so the settlement agreement hasn't changed, nor has the compact, nor have the rights. So there is some ability to adjust that. And this is just based on what I know. Again, I'm not the expert in it. But they look at what that snowpack level is and what the contracts say and what the demands are. And that's how they determine what the lake elevation is going to be, right? So they have responsibilities for flood control. So they have a target elevation generally of 59.18. I think it's at the end of April. And so if we're at 59.22, then they actually have to shed water off through the winter to try to get down to that, so they have some ability to store water for flood control. There's a lot of discussion about that right now. Division of Water Rights and Division of Water Resources are the folks that are addressing that, as far as can they change that elevation. And there is some flexibility. If they get to January and February and they see that the lake's at 59.19, but we don't have a lot of snowpack, then they can keep it at 59.19. But if they get there and we're at 59.18 and there's a whole lot of snowpack, they're going to be looking at that flood control. Does that make sense? Like I said, other folks are the experts in that, but it's fairly well defined in that settlement agreement. Anything else? Like I said, I'm happy to answer individual questions as we go on, but thank you again for all coming, and I hope I'll see you at future meetings as well.